Would you like to introduce yourself, tell us your science, and what brings you here?
Sure. Hey everyone, I'm Lori, she, her, and I have a background in the social sciences. My background is in anthropology and human-computer interaction. And yeah, I'm here to mostly learn today. I heard there's going to be a really great presentation and science under martial law, so really excited to hear all about that.
Awesome. You hear that, Carla? You ready? You pumped?
Lori actually helped me with the slides, with the design, so cute.
All right, I'm gonna pass the metaphorical mic to you.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, so actually my laptop camera doesn't work, so I'm just gonna, well, I'm on my phone, but I'm gonna leave it through my phone just because it distracts me. But okay, thanks everyone for coming to ABS's Kumustahan and for attending this session. This is actually new because Kumustahan is usually just like check-in, and also we did a different thing the past 2 days, oh no, 2 weeks, where we actually ask everyone to present their research. But today, tonight, or today to some of you, we have a different session where we actually look at our history. So it's gonna be kumustahan tungkol sa kasaysayan. So if folks don't actually know the Tagalog word for history, it's kasaysayan. And yeah, well, it's important to really look at our history just because it's basically part of us, and that's why we're actually here, and it's kind of had put us in a direction that in the past has guided us to where we are now. And so this is a good session that I'm really excited to share with you all. And even though I actually grew up in the Philippines, there's still a lot of the Philippine history that I don't know. And trying to prepare for this presentation, like the past few days, has really helped me, like, dig deeper into our country's history, and I want to share that to you all here. So yeah, from the social media posts that we have, and from the discussion that I've been promoting to you all, this session will be talking about science under martial law. But along the whole discussion, you would see that science and technology is actually very much interrelated to the economy, the social political situation of the country, and you cannot really separate science and technology from that. So we'll see a little later how this intersections come through, and what are the real situation of the science and technology sector back then, and how it has affected really the other facets of our society. And so Lori actually put this slide when we were preparing this, and I was about to talk about like the objectives of this, but this actually hit me a lot, the question of why are we here? Because technically we could take the question as like, why are we here right now and why are we listening? But also a deeper, a deeper take on it would be, why are we here? Like, why are we in the US? Or why are we, if you're in the Philippines, why are we in this current situation right now? And so I think looking back into our history, and especially the dark times of martial law, will give us a big perspective on why are we really here, and why do we need to listen, and why do we need to be here at this moment? So yeah, there will be 4 parts of this. I'll discuss about, just a general overview of martial law, digging a little bit deeper into the science, and also give a comparison in how it is very much reflected in our current society under Duterte, and what can we actually do as Filipinos in the US or in the Philippines or other sides of the world. So yeah, martial law under Marcos. I don't know if I could actually do an audience participation here, but do folks know when did their relatives or parents, grandparents move to the US? Anyone could just unmute yourselves and say things, or maybe yeah, use the chat. Okay, so yes, late 80s, mine moved in the US in 94. Cool. 90s, early 90s, but perhaps a few years before I was born. Cool. 90s. Nice. Okay, so that's a really great perspective. Oh wow, Natalie, 1972. Yes, that's exactly where martial law was actually implemented in the Philippines. So I put 1972, in parentheses here because technically martial law was promulgated back in 1972. That's the exact year. But since 1965, Marcos has actually been the president of the Philippines already. So he kind of been the president of the Philippines for like 21 years. And so there's a lot of, a lot of the policies in the Philippines are actually like up until now, we could still feel the ramifications of his term as a president. So yeah. Anyway, so martial law basically means that instead of having a civil ruling in the government, you actually have the military ruling. So you have the military basically ruling on the civilians. You have like curfews, and one of the important thing here is there's also a writ of habeas corpus. So writ of habeas corpus literally means having the body. So basically, during martial law, you don't have a warrant of arrest. So you could have warrantless arrest. This is because martial law is supposed to be a time, or supposed to be something that you issue or you promulgate because of the civil unrest. And so you want to suspend writ of habeas corpus so that justice will be expedited. So justice and quote unquote for that. But that's basically the reason why Marcos declared martial law back in 1972. He felt like there was civil unrest, but this is actually due to just a fake assassination plot to one of his, to his actually defense minister Enrile, and he kind of used that as a way or as a reason to actually declare martial law and to further seize power in the government. So basically, this is what he said in that announcement. So I need to proclaim martial law to save the republic and to form a new society. And so really, what we want to do right now is to dissect what was a new society and why Marcos actually ended up having martial law. So yeah, this is just a brief overview of the economic and social political situation back then, but this is a very big number, big numbers, but we'll give you a real overview of what was martial law and what was the new society back then. So during Marcos' time, there was accumulation of $24.4 billion debt. there was corruption of 5 to 10 billion US dollars. And because of these corruption and dire economic situation of the people resulted to a lot of protests and a lot of resistance, resulting to them being killed by the state forces, by the military, or by the police. So there's a record of 3,240 individuals who were killed under martial law, but there are also record of like 70,000 who were imprisoned and 30,000 who were tortured. So it's important to take note that the 3,000 is really just, you know, the number of people who were recorded. And it's not even like back then, the recording of all these killings were not even that efficient in the rural areas. So you would expect there were more killings back then, just because, you know, there's social unrest because of the poverty that the people are experiencing. And we will be talking a lot about that as it intersects with the situation of science and technology. So yeah, now that I've kind of give you an overview of how the situation of martial law back then in terms of numbers, I was actually very interested into looking at the science and technology situation back then, because even though I grew up there and I studied there until college, you were not really taught a lot about martial law. These are briefly mentioned to us in elementary school or high school, but really there are no information on how this has actually affected a lot of our fields, our science and technology. And I believe Zaika here, who works in who is from Quago, also has the same question. And also, if I also want to put this here, that if folks has actually inputs in this discussion, feel free to barge in and chime in and talk and share some points that you know, because what's happening here is there's really a lot of historical revisionism. If you do Google search about, you know, the science and technology situation in the Philippines, you see that all of it are actually good things that are being publicized, but there is a major disconnect with what the scientists and the people are actually experiencing back then. And so it's important that I think Zaika's work actually in, you know, like compiling all these resources and writing about the history of martial law it's a good way to actually battle historical revisionism and to really look at in a critical manner how, you know, how martial law has actually affected the country in general. So yeah, so for this, I actually have these as my main references. I've only seen very few articles about it. And although they don't technically speak a lot or speak directly about science and technology, I could see the intersection of all these articles on, you know, like giving kind of a brief overview of what was science and technology back then. So these are the two papers. One is mainly on education, one is on agrarian reform, and there are websites here that you all could also check that are giving you some ideas on martial law. But this one site here actually gives more detailed information, like more numbers of science and technology in the Philippines from 1960s to 1990s or 1980s. Yeah, so using these references, I would like just to show folks how, you know, like how was the situation of science and technology back then based from the data given by these articles or references. So yeah, and so in the 1973 Philippine Constitution, which was amended by Ferdinand Marcos, he actually put a section there that's that section 9 that says the state shall promote scientific research and invention. The advancement of science and technology shall have priority in national development. And this is something that is widely publicized online in some websites that, they've been pertaining to the Marcos era is actually the moment where science was prioritized in the Philippines. But there's also a different question on it on why was it prioritized and for whom was the science made for. So that's a question that we want to answer along the way. So back in the time of Marcos, there's actually a rise of technocracy. Does anyone know about what technocracy is about? Some social scientists here, and feel free to talk. But yeah, so during that time, in the time of Marcos, he actually hired a lot of technocrats. So technocrats are people who are professionals, who are academics, who are experts in a particular field, and he appointed them into office so that like it would look like a legitimate appointment of having someone or having an expert into office because they're actually apolitical, so they're non-political, and they would probably push for policies that would, in like basing from the science, would actually benefit the people. That is actually a good thing, technically, but during the time of Marcos, his two prime technocrats are actually these people, Cesar Virata and Gerardo Siquet, who are renowned economists. And although they are very expert in economy and like talking about numbers and economics and etc., their main agenda wasn't really supportive or was not really serving the interests of the country, because these two individuals actually promoted for free market, liberalization, and export-oriented Philippines. In that case, they're really pushing for more foreign investors to come in the Philippines, and with that, there is, like there's kind of a there's kind of a consequence of actually asking foreign investors to come into your country. So then you would need to have a lot of like less privileges in terms of your labor force and your workforce, and also a lot of very unbalanced agreements between the two, so that you would favor more of the more benefits for the foreign investors. And that's what these technocrats are actually been pushing throughout the term of Marcos.
Sorry to interrupt. Did you say they were communists?
No, they're not. They're technocrats.
Okay. Technocrats, okay.
Yeah, they're economists.
Oh, economists, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No worries. So yeah, so during this time, so I kind of like just want to put that in there, how Marcos actually hired technocrats who are more business minded, in terms of like, laying the policies in the Philippines so that we could look into the situation of education, agriculture, health, and other aspects of the society under that lens. So if you look at the situation of education, you need to remember how these technocrats has actually been influencing how these policies are being made. So, okay, so let's start with education. In a lot of the State of Nation addresses of Marcos, he has been pertaining to science as a playing a very important role for national development. And so from 1967, he already directed the Department of Education to revitalize science courses. And at the end of his term, he actually also established the Philippine Science High School in Mindanao and Visayas. But these are actually things that are, you know, like put out there, even though there is really no systematic progress in the elementary and secondary education. So there are a bits of projects that Marcus have been doing, but they're not really consistent in terms of how many students are actually getting access to these educations. Because Philippine Science High School, for example, is like only a few campuses all around the Philippines. And it doesn't even encompass like very rural areas. So back then, during the time of Marcos, from this data of the Philippines statistical yearbooks, you could see that there is actually a rapid expansion of tertiary education, and this was not in par with the development of the elementary and secondary education. So why was this happening? It's really because there is a monopoly of tertiary education. So there is a rise of private tertiary education in the Philippines because it's being considered as a commodity. And so that has been like a business for people. And if you could see here, ranging from 1946 to 1985, private institutions are just very much higher in number compared to public education. And if you say public education, these are actually institutions that are supported by the government. So then during the time of Marcos, there's really not much support in terms of public tertiary education as well as in the elementary and secondary education. And there are more private institutions that are actually considering it as a business. So now you have, like in 1985, there's actually as far as 838 private institutions compared to only 319 public government funded institutions. And so what happened with, with the rise of tertiary education and the commodifying education, basically, there is actually an excess of manpower back then during the time of Marcos. This is a data that I pulled up from one of the sites that I mentioned a while ago. And this table actually shows the science and technology manpower in the Philippines. As you can see here, this number here would be the total number of scientists and engineers during that time, but only a few of them actually work in R&D. So as you can see, this is the total of those who are working in R&D. So from 81,000 total in 1965, only like around 30% of them are actually in the workforce in research and development. And the same trend happens like 4 years or 5 years after, and this trend actually continues because there's just a lot of people graduating from tertiary education, but then the budget for National Science and Technology, the National Science and Technology Authority is not at par with the number of people who are actually graduating. So National Science and Technology Authority is actually kind of like the Department of Science and Technology right now, who makes research and development, who directs projects in the Philippines, and identifies and gives funds for those science-based research projects. And so with this decreasing funds from 76 to 85, you could see that there is really an imbalance between the number of people or the excess manpower you're producing and the budget that you're giving for research and development. And so the economy or even the research and development sector in the Philippines during that time could not really absorb those excess manpower. And if you look at the industry as well, there are no industries that are actually present in the Philippines. There are only very few local industries who could direct their own product and would, like, produce their own products and sell them. There's only a few of them, and most of the factories in the Philippines that time are actually owned by foreigners. And even though Marcos had this initiative called Industrial Incentives Act of 1967, which aimed at stimulating the investment in industrial enterprises from local investors, this actually failed because during the time of Marcos, aided by his technocrats, what has been promulgated, or what has been, the environment um, that's been promulgated at that time is to have a free market, liberalization, meaning like loosening or easing up of our market to outside forces to different countries or foreign countries, and also having an export oriented industry. So if you say export oriented, that basically means that we are exporting raw materials, but we don't have the capacity to actually process these materials in our own country. So there was this called dependency theory, where we don't have our own technology and local machineries. So we actually just depend on other countries, like for example, US, to invest in us, use our cheap labor, and then sell our raw materials, which is cheap, and then import those materials to us as a more expensive product. So for example, like if you have, I don't know, maybe a Manila paper, or I don't know if in the Philippines is that produced. I don't know, maybe this is hypothetical, but maybe if you have a mango and you can produce that in the Philippines. Oh, wait, let's have sugarcane. So if you have a sugarcane, you're actually producing sugar as a raw material to other countries, but then other countries will process that as coke, and then coke will then be imported in the Philippines. So and coke will be imported as a much expensive price than the price of the raw materials that we actually produce for them. So in this case, like in the context of science and technology, because we don't have our own local industry, we can't use our engineers and scientists to actually make these technologies, because these are not even supported in our economy. And so there came in the labor export policy, because we have excess manpower. We have 700,000 graduates each year. Ferdinand Marcos basically had this labor export program as an emergency development strategy. So because we don't have the economy that could absorb this excess manpower, let's send them to other countries so that they could be migrant laborers and could actually send remittances in the Philippines. And I guess that is where actually brain drain kind of come up as a very systematic problem in the country, because and this happens even now, where we have like scientists and technology workers who don't see any opportunities in the Philippines that would allow their growth as scientists and technology workers. So then they're forced to actually leave the country and to find other opportunities abroad. And so just to give context then, if your family or grandparents actually move around this time, that's also one of the high times when most of the Filipinos are actually leaving the country, because of the imbalance in the economy and the imbalance of having a lot of graduates, but we don't have jobs available in the Philippines. And so this became a synchronized system. And basically, this is what Marcos has been known for in the Philippines. He basically institutionalized labor export policy, and he synchronized it with education. So if you could look at this table, this technical vocational education project is something that they came up with so that they could hire or they could train individuals to do some, like technical jobs or technical training so that they could send them into other countries as service workers, sales workers, or clerical workers. So because of the failure in doing a domestic or promoting domestic industrialization in our country, they had to institutionalize these training programs and institutionalize the labor export policy so that they could send Filipinos abroad as migrant laborers and get income from them through their remittances. And so, yeah, with that, that's basically an overview of how the science and technology workers are affected by martial law. And if anyone has a question right now, feel free to actually barge in, because then I will move into the next part where, we'll talk about how in the economy, there are policies or projects led by Marcos which are actually not scientific based and had affected a lot of people in terms of like land grabbing or pushing or displacing indigenous communities.
So, hey, Carla, where was this labor exported to, mainly?
Yes. So in 1970s, there's actually an oil problem back in the Middle East.
Okay.
So most of these people were sent in the Middle East. But this is also a high time where there is a lot of healthcare workers that was sent in different parts of the world. And there's also the migration to the US of most healthcare workers, like nurses.
So this migration of, say, healthcare workers is directly associated with the mismanagement of like the SNCs?
I would say in terms of education, yes. But I guess the part on the healthcare workers is already part of this systematic combination of education with labor export policy. So I think I don't exactly know which year, but there was a time in the Philippine history, and even when I was still in high school, that there's a peak of nursing schools in the Philippines, and there's still a lot of nursing school in the Philippines because this was seen as a way to actually export labor into other countries. But yeah, that incorporating that in the labor export policies later on, but I don't exactly. Yes.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you. Yes, and yeah, I've seen a lot of videos of why are there so many Filipino nurses in the Philippines? Okay, cool. So now I'll jump in quickly into different science related projects. And these are some of the examples and case studies. So there's the part of energy. Marcos has actually been pushing for nuclear energy in the Philippines, and I don't know if you all have seen this in history or in the news that there is actually this Bataan nuclear power plant that was built during the time of Marcos. So during his time, he actually assisted a lot of institutions in undertaking nuclear energy work, and he actually sent a lot of scientists to study abroad. But in that case, you know, there's a view that if you're actually hiring a lot of nuclear scientists to work on nuclear energy, you would be able to listen to these scientists. But unfortunately, that didn't happen in this case where he built the Bataan nuclear power plant. So this nuclear power plant was established in 1976, and basically what happened in here is that there was a foreign contractor called Westinghouse that has a connection with Marcus. And from that contract where they proposed a $650 million, you know, in establishing a power plant, that actually ballooned to 2.2 billion. And a large sum of that money were found to have been, was found to be corrupted by Marcos. And aside from that, you know, like aside from that corruption case, there's also a lot of issues with the power plant where there are different safety protocols that were ignored, and the materials that were used were not at par with what should be used. And even then, this power plant was also really built hastily, even though there are different geohazards that were mentioned to Marcos. And now actually Duterte is trying to revive this. But this power plant is actually proximal to active faults near a volcano. And so if you make this, you know, operational, there's actually a lot of risk that is attached to it. So a lot of people have been opposing the nuclear power plant. And during the time of Marcos, he actually did not listen to different geologists who have been mentioning those risks. And so this right now is not operational, and we spent $2.2 billion on this, and the Filipino people have been paying this debt.
So were there no alternatives? Were there no proposed locations that?
Yeah, actually, there's an alternative to revive this, but this would actually cost more than the actual.
No, what I'm saying is because it's near the near an active volcano. Was there any proposed locations other than there?
No, I would need to research on that.
Oh, okay.
But I guess I think.
Because I'm just wondering why would Japan, which is, you know what Japan is, where their geographical location is, and they're prone to earthquakes and all this sort of thing. So I mean, they were successful in having nuclear power plants, and they're all, you know, popping up everywhere as well. But
actually, they cited one incident in Japan where there was this nuclear power plant that. You know, because it was situated in a very risky geographical area as well, had tsunami and stuff like that, and that's already in Japan, where, as you know, is already advanced. So in this power plant where even safety protocols were ignored and the materials were not really, you know, were not safe, and yeah, so it's just very risky, and the people are really concerned about making this operational. So yeah. And another one is this Chico River Dam project that was, there was a proposal to establish 4 dams in Cordillera region, which will affect thousands of indigenous people on the Chico River. And this will actually cost 31.5 million pesos of farmlands damage. And if it will push through, it will cause flooding whenever, you know, like, you know, Philippines is visited by a lot of typhoons. So this project was being pushed by Marcos without really consulting the indigenous peoples, mostly the Kalinga. So it was met with organized opposition among the people of Cordillera. And in here is Makliing, who was actually the leader of the tribe, who was killed by the state forces during that time of martial law, because he was the leader of the opposition who were really against the dam. So those are just like science things that, you know, like have affected our communities. And one other thing is Masagana 99, which is part of the Green Revolution project of Marcos. So he has been promoting the use of high yielding varieties in the Philippines to increase agricultural production, particularly rice. So there's this high yielding variety called IR8, which actually needs a lot of fertilizers and pesticides, and you need also a lot of irrigation for it. So although this project was initially successful, it later on failed because the farmers could not afford having credit in fertilizers and these high yielding varieties. So, and another concern that most progressive organizations have been talking about is that these high yielding varieties are actually not as, you know, like not conducive for replacing the traditional varieties, because these high yielding varieties needs fertilizers and pesticides where we need to have a lot of costs, but also it affects the environment in several ways with the ecosystem of the fields or the rice fields. So that didn't succeed. And I guess I'll just be quick on this, but I guess I briefly want to mention why that wasn't successful is also because even though Marcos that time had a land reform, it is actually just very virtual in that it has only met 2.27% of its target. So what happened in land reform during Marcos' time is that they've only been only scope. There's a limited scope of it, so they only covered rice and corn lands for distribution, and has not distributed coconut, banana, and other industries. And so there's really just limited lands that are being distributed to the farmers. So basically the farmers do not have their own land. And so they don't, if they don't have their own land, they need to buy fertilizers and pesticides and need to pay for irrigation. Basically, the whole project failed because of that, because the farmers do not have their own things for production. And why is that, or why was land reform not successful? It's actually because of crony capitalism that happened during the Marcos time. So the martial law gave Marcos the powers that enabled him to give his cronies control over various Philippine industries. So for coconut industry, Danding Cuangco or Enrile has been controlling the logging industry, and the banana industry by Antonio Florendo. So Marcos has connections to these people. And so if you see back then why it's only rice and corn that's being distributed, it's because the other industries are owned by the people that he has close links to. And to take note, in the 1970s, he also established the Philippine Coconut Research Institute, which if the people of the farmers don't actually own them, it will only benefit. So like the government fund for these research will only benefit those people who are controlling these industries, and even the textile for banana industries. So yeah, so because of that, because of the dire situation of the people, there's a lot of protests during that time. And this is one example in Negros, where there's a plummet of the price of the sugar cane. And so because of poverty and no jobs and hunger, people had to resort into protesting because they need to have a means to live and survive. But the answer to these protests are actually more violence from the landowners and those people who control the industries. And so this happened back then, where there's a massacre of people who were protesting, and there were around 30 people who died in this massacre. And these different protests happened in different regions of the country until um, until later, when we had the People Power of 1986, where we actually ousted the dictator.
Sorry, Carla.
Mhm.
So did all these riots persisted post martial law? Like, were there any conflicts with farmers, like during
Yes, yeah, that's a
during
really good
the
question.
subsequent presidents, like
Mhm.
Aquino and Ramos?
Right, that's a really good question, because yes, if you actually look at history, there's Mendiola massacre as well, and that happened because if you look at the background of Cory Aquino, she's actually connected with Dundee Quanco and Aquinos, so they're actually landlords as well.
No, okay.
So yeah, those things happen. And I didn't mention this, but during Marcos' time, there was really no priorities on health. They put $229 million into private hospitals that specialize in single organ diseases, even though most of the kids are actually dying from preventable illnesses like diarrhea, nutrient deficiency, and stuff like that. So the UNICEF has commented that there's actually a gross misallocation of resources in the Philippines. So yeah, that's basically it. And I hope I actually showed you how, like, even in different aspects of the the country, in the economy, in the social political side of the country, there's science that we need to follow, and I think what prevailed here is really just the political interest of the then dictator Marcos.
So,
As
sorry,
well. Mhm.
can you go back to the previous slide? So there was an increased mortality of pediatrics disease, or so babies,
There is.
children.
Mhm.
But
This is
then all these hospitals and medical centers, are they all for kids?
no,
No. Okay, so
no.
that is probably why there's a high incident of
And also,
babies.
yeah, most of these are actually related to
So they should
malnutrition,
have
because they
probably
don't
built
have.
a children's hospital or something like that.
Yeah, I think there should be kind of like an allocation on like general hospitals to look at, diarrhea or other preventable illnesses. Even until now, there's still measles outbreak in the Philippines, or polio
So it
outbreak.
would probably be good to know what was the Philippines condition in terms of kidney diseases, cardiovascular disease. Was there any decline that could be, you know,
Yeah, that's a
associated with all these institutions being built or something like that?
Right, that's a good point. Actually, during the time of Marcos, a lot of his projects are like what Duterte has been doing. It's more of build, 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 and modernization without even really looking at, like the scientific basis of them. Imelda Marcos, his wife, is actually like the promulgator of having this Philippine Heart Center and stuff like that, even though, yeah, it's not the main disease that's prevalent during that time. So yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so yeah, so then I'll just move on how, the situation back then is not really separate from what's happening right now in the Philippines. So as we all know, the COVID situation in the Philippines is very dire. There's an increasing rate every day, rate of cases and deaths. And the way it's being approached is through militaristic a way, and the people are really not having any aid coming from the government, and so with this situation, what the Philippine government has been actually focusing on is beautification projects. So one example is, the Manila Bay beautification. I don't know if you all have heard about this, but they dump dolomite sand, which is coming from Cebu to Manila Bay so that it would look nice. And it cost 389 million pesos. And that's something that they could actually give already to people who are struggling during the pandemic. Aside from that, I just want to really focus on how Duterte, just like Marcos, is actually focusing on building infrastructures without really considering, the people who will be affected and the science behind all these projects. So yeah, because like the Manila Bay beautification a while ago could actually affect all the marine species in the Manila Bay, and a lot of scientists were against it. And the same with Kaliwa Dam, where this 12.2 billion pesos Kaliwa Dam project will displace the indigenous people in Quezon province. And they said that it would actually supply water to Manila, but a lot of people are skeptical about it because there's no shortage of water in Manila. It's mostly just controlled by a few people. And there's also, in terms of like agriculture, there's also rice tariffication law that was passed by Duterte early on in his term, which actually allowed other countries to import rice to to the Philippines. And so what happens is that there's actually low prices of rice because since other countries have better, technology to produce more rice, they give more surplus to the Philippines and they sell it in a much lower rate. So the farmers don't have, have need or are forced to actually sell their rice products in a very small price or a very low price. So yeah, and he also declared martial law in Mindanao when the Marawi siege happened, and the martial law was declared because he wants to actually rebuild Marawi and help with the reconstruction of Marawi after the IC siege. But 3 years after that siege, the Marawi situation is still like this. So there's no renovation, still no reconstruction, and the people have evacuated and are not allowed to actually come back into their homes. And there's a lot of news about having rehabilitation projects, like new projects that is also part of his Build Big program, so that Marawi could be considered as a tourist destination. And because of that, because of, like the misappropriation of budget, and also because of the dire the dire the dire situation of the country with no jobs, the same as what happened in Marcos, and people being forced to leave the country. There's a lot of people who've been resisting and are skeptical to this government. And so for 2 times in a row, the Philippines was actually declared as the dubious country for environmental defenders, because we have a lot of people who are defending our own lands of our indigenous peoples, and also like farmers who want the right to the land that they till. So yeah, so there's a lot of human rights violations in the Philippines, and I know that a lot of people are aware of this, but when Duterte came into power, he has pushed for this war on drugs that now has killed 30,000 people. Aside from that, the Philippines is also one of the most dangerous country for journalists because of of what they actually share to the public in terms of their work as journalists. So yeah,
How is that, what's the danger? I mean, sorry, like in terms of how dangerous it is it worse than during the massacre that occurred in Mindanao involving media personnel?
oh, is this the Ampatuan massacre?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think that's the one.
right. I think it's even well, that time was during Arroyo, right? And right now it's actually even it's even what you call that is it's even dangerous because even though outrightly Duterte is not declaring martial law in the Philippines, it's already happening. He has an executive order that asks the military to actually be full force in harassing and killing different activists and human rights defenders, particularly in Bicol, Negros, and Mindanao. So that has been one of the one of the most dangerous things that he's done, and he actually legitimized those particular attacks. And even right now, he has still been supporting all those clans and different impunities that's happening. And he himself has been, telling outright in media that shoot that person or, like kill or like shoot her vagina and stuff like that. So those are things that really makes all these situations dangerous because even though there's no martial law, what's happening right now is exactly what martial law is. And so what more if he actually, like declare that outright and everything would be totally be a disaster. So yeah, and I'm glad you asked that question, Jay, because the next step would be what can we do, like right now what we can really do is to remember martial law in the Philippines, but also recognize that the martial law back then is not really different from what's happening right now. And we as scientists and like as members as Filipino community really has a responsibility to protect our democracy, and because as we see from this presentation, really our situation as science and technology workers or as scientists is not really separate from what's happening in our society, because of the situation of the Philippines economically back then. A lot of folks had to migrate away from the country and to be away from their homelands, and that's basically why most of us are actually here. So because of that, there are a lot of ways that we could take action. There's a Philippine Human Rights Act that's being enacted by a lot of organizations here in the US. And it basically, the Human Rights Act basically asks us to ask the US to stop sending military aid to the Philippines because that's being used by the armed forces of the Philippines and the Philippine National Police to actually push through with all these human rights violations. And just right now, well, BEA actually shared that they have, BEA is part of Kabataan Alliance, and they have a press conference for the Philippine Human Rights Act, and there are already 21 US legislators who have introduced this into the US Congress. So there's a lot of attention on it, and the European Parliament also asked Duterte to be probed with his human rights violations, and he just recently addressed the UN as well, and we've been asking the UN as well to do an independent investigation on it. So yeah, I think as an organization, what we could do is actually endorse the Philippine Human Rights Act and also sign this along with the U.S. legislators and different organizations in the U.S. And that's basically it. If people have questions, I see there's like 57 messages in the chat, but I don't know. I cannot backread. But people, yes, Rose, you want to talk about that? Okay. Do folks have questions? But I guess this is actually a paragraph that really, like connects with me and resonates with me while I was reading that paper. And okay, maybe let's start here. So this relates to the socializing role of education in the Philippine context, which involved schooling and other institutions emphasizing the essentially private or nature of morality, and downplaying or ignoring the civic of or public dimension. So in other words, education in the Philippines has overwhelmingly been seen as involving the acquisitions of skills which one then deploys for individual benefit or for the sake of one's family. So its role in fostering or promoting engaged participatory notions of citizenship that might lead to searching social or political critique has tended to be downplayed or ignored. Instead, education under Marcos has sought to minimize any popular expectations of the state. So yeah, it resonates with me just because, it's just, I think, part of Philippine culture how most of our education are really just to acquire skills so that we could help our family, and it's more individualistic. But I think this is a culture that we can change, and that's why we're here. We're starting that revolution.
So, Carla, I mean, I'm trying to, I like to listen on both sides. So I also listen to another side of the argument. So some people would argue that these voices from like human rights organizations are hypocrites because they tend to ignore the fact that, they don't say anything or condemn children that are involved in military activities, those that are in rebel groups. And also perhaps say something about the Catholic Church that has been involved in abuses of children, sexual abuses, this sort of thing. I'm not sure how would the organization would respond to that.
Yeah, I think that's a very I don't know, cliche argument coming from the government. I don't think I don't know, I'm taking this as my personal opinion. And I think I've listened to that speech of Duterte in the UN yesterday when he talked about exactly that that different organizations are weaponizing human rights. But I guess the real question really is, why are people being pushed to become rebels? If people actually have the means to live and survive in a country and they don't see anything that's wrong with the economy and social situation, why
so
are
it's
there
okay to promote kids to join? I mean, not promote, but not discourage it, but let it go.
I think I'm not sure about if that is actually true. But I guess there are, from my own knowledge, there are teenagers who are knowledgeable and have the capacity to decide for themselves, who who decided to do that because of the situation.
I wouldn't say teenagers are not in a position to decide. I mean, we always get a lot of problems in the Philippines in terms of teenage pregnancies. and these are decision makings that are crucial for the
Yeah.
fate of their future, isn't it? Like,
Right.
I
Yeah.
think it's just
I
sort of guidance.
If I may add,
yes.
sorry. Yeah, if I may add about the kids going into the rebel or communist groups. This is common in Mindanao. By the way, I grew up in the Philippines too, so I'm familiar about what's happening. It's usually common in Mindanao because they get funded. I mean, they get the teenagers who turn into rebels are come from families who are poor, who don't have enough food to eat, and joining those groups give them more money. But in the I think the real issue is the killings are very obvious. It's the small pushers that are killed, but the big fish are already out of jail. Duterte actually freed the big drug lords. So I think that's a real issue here.
Right. Yes. And I think that's also what human rights groups have been pertaining to in a lot of their advocacies. Yeah. And I think, I don't know, there's a lot of discussion on this. But for me personally, I don't see how, like people deciding to be rebels to be, like a bad thing if they're actually pushed because of the situation. And that's something that, we need to recognize, that because there is social unrest and because the government cannot provide solutions to this problem, other groups are taking a different action to look for justice. Yes, someone wants to.
I like, something that's been on my head lately is that like are we as a society putting way too much power onto government and leaders? Like, how much like do they matter, I guess? Like, like we could argue that, yeah, duh, obviously they do, but there's the reverse causality to all of these things. Like, Marcos was elected, and I think that in some ways, like some of the programs that he started, we can't talk about his intent of whether or not he actually did want to, like if he was an opportunist who realized that, oh, maybe I will start this program, and then during contract signing and stuff, he's like, oh, and I could make money out of it, And so, I mean, like, I don't know if this is like part of what Jay was saying. Like, what is kind of stuck in my head is that I think that there's a lot of things that we're doing or blaming onto the government, but as people and members of society, we also have power to change things, and there isn't a lot of kind of like internal reflection on what we could do. I don't know, just because like I'm reading like some papers, like economists have like studied whether or not leaders actually do matter. And around the time that Marcos was a leader, it's like the nation building time of the whole world. Like it was mentioned in the chat that there was a global recession then. All of Southeast Asia just started becoming the nations that they are now, and they're all writing these new policies and things like that. So, but not all of the leaders at that time were named dictators, yet they most likely had implemented the same sort of policies that Marcos did. You know what I'm saying? So it's kind of like, what is the difference between like, and I think that what sets it apart is intention, and we can't go back to it now, but like, how come we don't look back to Aquino and Ramos and Arroyo and Aquino again, and like they had like they had some power into changing something, or at least trying to make things better or solving it, and yet it didn't happen. And they probably also implemented all these new policies. And as a culture, we're a little bit more into thinking that these are better presidents, but maybe they're not. Maybe they are just as bad as Marcos. You know, like,
Yeah.
yeah.
I wouldn't say they are better presidents. I like in my opinion, they're also the same, like just what Che has mentioned about, you know, even after martial law, there are still a lot of protests because of also the character of all these presidents. Like Cory is a landlord. She's a part of like a big companies and part of the ruling class. So yeah, I think that's a very good point. And I think because of that, I want to go back into like, does the government matter? So yeah, maybe we should ask that question. And also, yeah, like it's just really important for us to actually speak out and protest if we have the chance to, if we have the capacity to, and that, because that is necessary, because technically these people are in the ruling class and would probably not be able to know what our situation is. And so we need, and so when they pass these policies, they need to really listen to us instead of just pushing for their agenda. So
Well, I think government matters. Government matters much as people matters, culture and values matters in society. But I think what is we're going to look into is what sort of government would fit into the values and culture of a society would probably be something we could, you know, consider into. I mean, not all countries would probably be better off having a democratic, you know, a Western side of government. Maybe it works for them for something else, but because we are so westernized, Filipinos is so westernized, and we all take in Western stuff. We absorb anything American and European and stuff like that. But do we really have, I mean, can we reflect on, I mean, where Filipinos, what our history was, were we, you know, like a government that was like Americans in our history? I mean, that's probably something we should look into. And
yeah.
and I think, yeah.
Yes, great point. And yeah, not that you mentioned that, there's actually a part that talks about how the science and technology in the Philippines is still very colonial, and how most of the view, or like the view as being scientists is us being like taxonomists, or, you know, like mostly technician jobs and not really discoverer. So we're mostly like those people who would identify where mining spots are, or like what are the role of these natural products, so that we could help out foreign companies with all these information, instead of really driving development and having our own local industry. So yeah, cool. And I'm sorry, I kind of like talked a lot. But if folks wants to, you know, stay, I could stay for a bit as well. And if folks want to leave, thank you so much for attending this discussion. It's been really fruitful. And I love all your points. And I hope we could do a lot of these discussions in the future as well. Cool.
I just want to say something. Carla, I really commend you for doing this. I came from the Philippines. I grew up, I was raised in the Philippines, and I only just looked at the human rights side of martial law. And this presentation looked into the science and technology of it, and it's very enlightening and great research. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm crying.
I also like how, like personally, this made me realize how martial law affected many aspects of our society, like our healthcare system, our export of labor, everything.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's kind of what I want to show you all. Thank you.
I'm just curious, I don't know if there are any historians here, but were there any martial law being implemented in the Western society, like in America? Were there any point where there was a martial law?
I actually don't know if people have.
Yeah, I'm just curious.
Yeah. But yeah, that's an interesting thing to know.
I think sort of like a de facto martial law in the US, even now. I mean, with how anti-Black racism functions in society and the ways that the perpetrators of anti-Black racism, the murders of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, the way that their policemen, you know, are enacting these crimes and not being met with impunity is de facto martial law. I mean, it might not be, there's a lot more protections in place in the US compared to the Philippines, but I would say that it's leaning towards that, you know, because when you look at who has the power and who's being criminalized for what crime, who's being pardoned, that reflects some of the values of martial law, which is to suppress the masses, suppress freedoms, and use the law, in fact, to you know, promote like capitalism and to maintain the social structure, which in the United States is anti-Black and fundamentally anti-Indigenous. So never declared martial law, but do they ever declare that it's martial law? It's just, you know, it's our analysis of the conditions that really helps us to clearly see the conditions and the social hierarchy and the abuses of power from the outside.
Yes, thank you.
But thanks, Carla. This was really helpful from a social science perspective. Just, I was always trying to figure out like how science and like just oppression is intermingled in all of the concrete ways that it has manifested in our society. So thank you. This was really enlightening, and you did such a great job.
Thanks, y'all.
See you.
Ricky, do you wanna actually end it? No.
I was gonna say I have to go, but I do want to request if everyone can take a moment to open their video so we can see your lovely face and take a photo for the gram.
Oh my God, yes, Black Lives Matter, Sisters for Vienna. Okay.
All right.
Thanks for sticking, y'all. Yeah, my video doesn't work, but.
Okay. Awesome. I'm gonna take it and. All right. Actually, wait. I think I'm taking it. Okay, ready? 1, 2, 3. Cool. And then this, as your host, I just wanted to again drop the line. I'm going to drop it again. Here's the doc for any new people. I think. Oh, Christian's here. And Josh, if you haven't filled out our form, please do so. It's in the chat. This will allow us to have your contact and send you information and so forth, keep you connected for things like this. Again, Carla, this was an amazing presentation. It really echoes a lot of what's going on here, and you know, at its core, that you know, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, right? and yeah, and just if anybody here is out protesting for Breonna Taylor, please stay safe. And utilize friends and family, use your resources. You
And
know,
social distancing. Wear a mask.
wear your mask, but you know, stay safe, protesting and all of that.
I have a question. Are we going to be doing, are we going to be covering more social science stuff? I mean, this could broadly be considered social science stuff, like looking at history and the Marcos era and a lot of other stuff.
Yeah, I think it's necessary for us as scientists, right, to look at it into the perspectives of, you know, beyond. I think, yeah, not just them. I mean, some is very important, but like, yeah, that intersection of looking at our society, and whether it be politically, psychologically, economically, there are so many caveats that affect us. And that is, knowing is like part of dismantling, right? So it's great to engage in these spaces, and and it echoes the overall mission for ASA, right? To hold a space to produce change for not only us here, but also to our ancestors and families back home in the Philippines. So one of the missions, but
I'd like to share like an opinion. I mean, it could be not an opinion, but like from a physics standpoint, if we assume that like the world, like the universe, are like deterministic, like everything is set in stone, then you could like assume that social sciences are not, you know, arbitrary or willy-nilly. They're an extension of the natural sciences. It's just less well understood as of right now. So yeah, my question was to like basically say we should do more stuff like this.
yeah, I think crap, I might not be able to. If you do you have us on the Instagram thing, or on Instagram?
I think yeah.
Because we have a feedback form on there. I don't know if I could find it in time. And I also want to respect time. It's almost 9:30. Thank you, Anna. The link tree. What?
And we have social scientists in the group as well. So yeah, APSA is also not just STEM people, but also social scientists.
Yeah.
So everyone could share. Cool.
Yeah, I'm glad that more social scientists accepted in this group.
Yeah, and encourage the spaces, like, you know, tell your professional and academic or networks if they're interested about this. So, oh yeah. I guess that's it.
Yay.
All right.
Thanks, Ricky.
All right, Isang Bagsak, ready? Just kidding, I don't know how to do it.
I did it.
I was ready.
There you go. I'll get it better next time. All right, have a good night, everyone.
Thank
Thank you.
Bye.
Salamat.